Drop a like and do share. Leave your comments and do not forget to subscribe for more videos.
Hello students, welcome to Edupedia.com, your online gateway to the world of invaluable knowledge. So during our last discussion, we tried to understand perpetuities. In this session, let's try to understand the valuation of the perpetuities. Now, the valuation of the perpetuities, as already said, that perpetuities can be valued both in the case of an ordinary annuities as well as in the case of the growing annuities. So, we are more concerned with calculating the present value of ordinary annuities as well as the growing annuities. We can also replace the word annuities by the perpetuities. We can even say that we are more interested in calculating the present value of ordinary perpetuities as well as the present value of the growing perpetuities. So, for the first condition, for calculation of present value of ordinary annuity or perpetuity, the formula is present value is equal to A upon I. While in the second case, for calculating the present value of a growing annuity, we shall be finding the present value is equal to A upon I minus G. You must be wondering that when we were discussing the present value of ordinary annuities, the formula looked a bit different, while in the case of the discussion of ordinary annuities in the light of perpetuities, the formulas are different. The same applies in the second case also. A few discussions before, we saw that the present value of a growing annuity has got a more elaborated formula, while in this particular case of the present value of growing annuities, which are in the nature of the perpetuities, the formula becomes more compressed, or it is a much smaller and a more docile looking formula. So for the first case, that is in the case of the present value of ordinary perpetual annuities, the formula is present value is equal to A upon I, while in the case of calculation of present value of the growing annual perpetuities, the formula is present value is equal to A upon I minus G. So now let's look at the derivation part. The legends say that A is equal to perpetual annuity cash flows, that they may be either ordinary or growing. Obviously, A stands for capital A. It is mainly refers to the annuities, whether they are ordinary or they are growing. I is the required rate of return or discounting rate. G is the growth rate. PV is the present value. That goes without saying. Now, let's start with the first thing first, that is the derivation of the formula for an ordinary perpetuity. In a geometric sequence, if R is less than 1 and N extends to infinity, then as the time approaches indefinitely towards infinity, the value of R to the power N gets closer and closer to 0. This is the most important parameter. This is the most important condition laid down, which shall help us in deriving the final formula. Let's look at it once again. Till now, we have been talking about the geometric progressions wherein we were having A as a first term, we were having the R as a common ratio, and A into R was raised to the power of N minus 1, wherein N referred to a definite number of finite years. The number of years are not infinite. The years were either 10 years, 12 years, 50 years, 20 years. How long they may be, they were not infinite. So when the N was a finite number, then we had to work out the calculations for calculating the sum total of the sum total of the geometric progression, either in the light of R being equal to 1 or R being not equal to 1, which was being further divided into two conditions, R being greater than 1 and R being lesser than 1. But in this particular case, in the case of perpetuities, you will find, students, that N, as we have already discussed, is not a finite number. N is not a fixed number. N doesn't represent a fixed number of years. So N over here is infinity. It means it might extend up to the end of time. It might go up to an unforeseen length of time. So obviously, if anything is going till the end of time, if it is going till infinity, the calculation becomes nearly impossible to calculate till the last term. It is remotely possible. It is absolutely a hypothetical concept. And even in the case of geometric progression, students, the condition where R is less than 1, I repeat, in the case of geometric progression where the N is an infinite number, where N extends to infinity and R is less than 1, we should be very careful about this point. The condition should be N should be infinity and R should be less than 1. So if N is an infinity and R is less than 1, then as we are moving more towards infinity, or as we are going deeper and deeper or farther and farther into the length of time, the term R to the power N gets closer and closer to 0 till a point come when it is almost 0. We can safely assume that r to the power n is equal to 0. Once again, students, let's discuss the property. Under the case of a geometric progression where the n extends to an infinite number, where n is not, or the number of years is not a finite fixed number, when n extends up to infinity, and if r is less than 1, so r should be less than 1 and n should be infinity. So if r is less than 1 and n is an infinity, then as we are moving more towards the timeline, as we are moving farther and farther in the years, or more and more n is coming into the picture, more the r to the power n shall be drawing towards 0. More and more the r to the power n shall be getting closer and closer to 0, till a time comes that after a very long time period of n, we will find that r to the power n is almost equal to 0, or it can be safely assumed that it is 0. So when Rn becomes 0, the entire formula changes. Obviously, it goes without saying, if Rn undergoes a figure called 0, or if Rn touches 0, then the entire formula undergoes a change, which is more on a simplified note. The change is quite simplified. The change is a more simple change because the main variables turns out to be 0. So let's apply the same logic in this particular case also. In the case of an ordinary annuity, in the case of calculating the present value of an ordinary annuity, which is in nature of a perpetuity, we find that r should be less than 1 and n should be equal to infinity. Then ultimately a point will come where the Rn will be almost closer to 0, or it can also be assumed to be 0. So let's see how this particular property affects the final formula of calculating the present value of an perpetual annuity. Now, students, if you may remember, the formula for the present value of an annuity is A multiplied by, within curly brackets, 1 upon I minus 1 upon I into 1 plus I to the power of n. Once again, students, you might see that the formula for the present value of an annuity is equal to A multiplied by, within curly brackets, 1 upon I minus 1 upon I into 1 plus I raised to the power n, curly bracket close, where the n is equal to infinity. This is a formula for calculating the present value of a normal annuity. This is the formula which has been used to calculate the present value of a normal annuity. Now we shall be using the same formula to calculate the present value of perpetual annuity, or an annuity which is going into infinity. That's why the n has been mentioned as infinity, or the term infinity has been assigned to n. Now students, one thing is very important over here, that in the formula p is equal to a multiplied by, within curly brackets, 1 upon I minus 1 upon I into 1 plus I to the power of n, where n is equal to infinity, the term 1 by 1 plus I represents the common factor r. Since we are calculating the present value, we know that while calculating the future value, 1 plus I was a common factor, but over here 1 upon 1 plus I is a common factor r. So when 1 upon 1 plus I is a common factor r, and since n is equal to infinity, we know that the n is extending up to infinity. Therefore, r to the power n shall look like 1 upon 1 plus I to the power n. It's very simple. When we assume that in the case of the present value of the future annuity, which is extending up to infinity, 1 upon 1 plus I happens to be the r, or the common ratio, then this particular common ratio r is being raised to the power n, wherein n is equal to infinity. So we have safely assumed that r to the power n can also be shown as 1 upon 1 plus I, which itself, with the entire term within the small bracket, is r, and r raised to the power n. Therefore 1 upon 1 plus I within small bracket has been raised to the power n. And we know that since n moves towards infinity, whenever n moves towards infinity, the entire term Rn becomes closer to 0, or eventually it becomes 0. So it can be assumed that when n is moving towards infinity, the entire term, that is 1 upon 1 plus I to the power of n, takes the form of a 0. Look at this very carefully, students. When 1 upon 1 plus I to the power of n becomes 0, it goes without saying this entire terms becomes 0, because when 1 upon 1 plus I to the power of n has been addressed as 0, therefore 0 multiplied by I is nothing but it is 0. Therefore, this entire term, that is 1 upon small I multiplied by 1 plus I to the power of 10, reduces to 0. So when this entire term reduces to 0, we are just left with the equation that is P is equal to A into, within curly brackets, 1 upon I minus 0 curly bracket close. So once again, students, when this entire term becomes 0, because 1 upon 1 plus I to the power of n has turned into 0 and 0 into I is 0, therefore this entire term eventually becomes a big 0. So when this terms become 0, it goes without saying it's quite a simple expression now, that the entire P, or the present value, becomes a function of A into 1 upon I, or P is equal to A upon I. Once again, students, when this entire term becomes 0, we are just left with, within the curly brackets, 1 upon I minus 0, that is 1 upon I, and 1 upon I multiplied by A gives us P is equal to A by I, or A upon I. So ultimately, the formula for the present value of an ordinary perpetual annuity is nothing but it is P is equal to A, that is the annuity, upon the discount rate. So once again, the present value of an ordinary perpetual annuity is equal to A, that is the annuity, upon the discount rate. So the entire formula reduces down to P is equal to A upon I. I hope this simple derivation is clear to you. Now let's come to the growing perpetuity. The last case we discussed was the case of an ordinary annuity which was moving towards perpetuity. Right now let's take up a condition wherein we are required to calculate, or we are required to derive the formula for present value of a growing perpetuity. Let's try to derive the formula of a present value of a growing annuity which is moving towards infinity or perpetuity. Now students, we all know that the present value of a growing annuity is represented by PVGA, or P is equal to A upon I minus G, within curly brackets 1 minus, within small bracket, 1 plus G upon 1 plus I raised to the power n curly brackets closed. So this is the formula we have discussed at length. The derivation also we have discussed at length quite sessions ago. We have discussed this very recently, so let's not get deeper into the derivation point. Let's try to come straight to the point. So in this entire formula, we know, students, that 1 plus G upon 1 plus I within small bracket raised to the power is equal to R. We have seen earlier also that R is equal to, within the small bracket, 1 plus G upon 1 plus I raised to the power n in the case of the growing annuities. In the case of calculating the present value of the growing annuities, we have seen that R is equal to 1 plus G upon 1 plus I, small brackets closed, raised to the power n. But the condition over here is that, as we have already discussed, R should be less than 1. In order to derive this formula, we have already seen that we have taken help of the mother formula, wherein Sn is equal to A into 1 minus R to the power n, bracket close, upon 1 minus R. So from that particular formula, this particular formula has been derived out. So the entire term R, that is 1 plus G upon 1 plus I raised to the power n, is equal to less than 1. So when the R is less than 1 and when n extends to 0, again the same rule applies, that the value of Rn is almost equal to 0. So when the value of Rn becomes 0, it goes without saying this entire term becomes 0. So the entire term eventually reduces to P is equal to A upon I minus G, within curly brackets 1 minus 0. Why 1 minus 0? Because in actuality this entire term within the small bracket 1 plus G upon 1 plus I to the power of n is actually the representation of R to the power n. In a nutshell, the term 1 plus G upon 1 plus I is a common ratio, that is R, and when R is raised to the power n, it takes the form of R to the power of n. But since n is equal to infinity, therefore R becomes 0 as per the rule. Therefore, this entire term reduces down to 0, thereby leaving us with the expression P is equal to A upon I minus G, within curly bracket 1 minus 0, that is 1 minus 0 is 1. So finally, the formula for present value of a growing perpetuity is equal to A upon I minus G. So you can just look at these particular lines also. In the case of a growing perpetuity where n is equal to infinity and the value of R is equal to 1 plus G upon 1 plus I, because R is less than 1. Why R is less than 1? Because we all know the I is more than G, because I is more than G. Thus when R less than 1 and n is infinity, we know that Rn approaches to almost 0. Therefore the entire term 1 plus g upon 1 plus r to the power of n shall be 0. So when this becomes 0, there's a final formula for present value of a growing perpetuity shall be p is equal to a upon I minus g within curly brackets 1 minus 0, that is 1. Finally, the formula becomes p is equal to a upon I minus g. Now, this particular formula p is equal to a upon I minus g, this is now very similar to the formula which we discussed in the case of the Gordon's model, this formula. P0 is equal to d1 upon k minus g. Of course, we didn't discuss its derivation in details, as I already said that this is not the right time for that. But after going through the derivation or the present value of a growing perpetuity, wherein P0 is equal to a upon k minus g or p is equal to a upon I minus g, you can very well relate the resemblance between these two formulas. Over there, a was an annuity. Over here, d1 is a stream of the dividend which is growing with a fixed rate of growth, and over here the k is the cost of equity. Over here the I was a required rate of return, should be more than g, that is k is more than g. The k has to be more than g in order to satisfy the condition of r being less than 1, so that the final formula of a present value of a growing annuity or the present value of a growing perpetuity can be derived. So much discussion on this when we shall be taking up the relevant chapters. But currently, if this discussion is clear to you that how exactly the present value of a growing perpetuity has been derived, then at a time when we shall be discussing the derivation of the equity valuation model with the help of the Myron-Gordon model, then you won't be surprised, you won't be thinking that where exactly we got the derivation, because by that time we shall already be acquainted with the derivation part. Now students, let's try to understand a simple illustration which says that suppose a bond promises to pay a coupon of 100 USD per year for an infinite time period. Calculate how much should the investor pay for the same today if his required rate of return is 15%. So one thing we are very much clear about in this particular question, that the bond is paying a coupon of 100 USD till infinity, but there is no growth in the coupon rate. The coupon rate is absolutely flat, it is constant till infinity without showing any rate of growth, but the required rate of return is 15%, or I is 15%. So we just need to see how exactly we can use the formula of the present value of an ordinary perpetuity. The question states clearly that the bond in question is a perpetual bond which comes with a promise of an infinite coupon payment of 100 USD till infinity. Since the required rate of return for the investor is 15%, by applying the formula, we can compute the price which he may have to pay today in order to buy the bond. Obviously, since it is a case of an ordinary annuity, because there is no growth involved, so we can safely assume the coupon of 100 USD till infinity as an infinite stream of an annuities which are ordinary in nature. So we are having the term A or annuity as 100 USD and the required rate of return is 15%. So by applying the formula which we use in the case of calculating the present value of an ordinary annuity, that is P is equal to A upon I. So P is equal to A was 100 USD upon 0.15. Therefore 667 USD is the price of the bond which the investor should pay if he wants to enjoy a stream of infinite coupon of 100 USD against his required rate of return of 15%. I hope these discussions are clear. You have understood the things in a better fashion and are having a more clear grasp on this particular concept of perpetuity. In the next sessions, we shall be talking more on the issue. Till then, thank you students. Happy learning.